Guglielmo Forges Davanzati, University of Salento, Italy. To Professor Stockhammer, I could add further external criticism to the picture of the labor market in the neoclassical approach, in the sense that there is large evidence that job search is mostly driven via parental social networks, and that individuals belonging to rich families easily obtain good jobs and high wages, also independently on their effective labor productivity. This implies that the labor supply curve does not reflect individual preference, but it depends on social or class affiliation. And this is to me, it is a very big problem as regard to social mobility, to the decline of social mobility. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Gentlemen, yes, please.
Yes, Yoon Kim, Bowdoin College in US. I have a question to the Laurence Ball. And so you emphasize the importance of this expansionary monetary policy after the recession for lowering unemployment. So according to your study, what should be the necessary duration of this expansionary monetary policy after the recession? So I was wondering about that.
Johan Muisking, University of Maastricht. I have a question to, well, maybe to all speakers. It's about the notion of unemployment, actually, because I think that you should also consider underemployment as a relevant issue, because what you see nowadays is that there's an enormous tendency in the labor market to keep people not unemployed, but underemployed. So the measured unemployment is not necessarily that high, but nonetheless, a lot of people are not working as much as they want. And as a consequence, there's a lot of labor slack, essentially, which could be considered as hidden unemployment and also be hidden in this hysteresis analysis. And might maybe even explain some of the artifacts noticed by Laurence Ball.
Okay, Eckhart?
Yes, Eckhart Hein, Berlin School of Economics and Law. A question to Laurence Ball. You focused very much on monetary policy and exchange rate when it comes to preventing persistent effects on unemployment. Why not fiscal policy?
Okay, perhaps we'll take those questions as a first round, and I'll ask the speakers in the same order as they spoke before, perhaps to address the questions.
Okay, on the question of how long monetary policy should be expansionary, I think the answer is it's hard to know in advance because, as Milton Friedman teaches us, policy has long and variable lags, and we don't really know the sizes of the effects, or it's hard to predict. So I think, practically speaking, if I were running a central bank and unemployment were high, I would loosen policy and see what happened. And if unemployment didn't fall, I'd loosen policy some more. And I basically keep easing policy until it looked like unemployment was headed back to where it started. And I think it would be hard, it's very state dependent how long that would take, and probably hard to predict. And the answer to why not fiscal policies, I think fiscal policy would also be a good remedy. I guess rightly or wrongly, I'm thinking of monetary policy as being, well, maybe in the U.S. and probably elsewhere, it's so, the best we can possibly hope from fiscal policy is that it doesn't move actively in the wrong direction. So that it's unrealistic politically. But I think theoretically, anything that would expand aggregate demand, which could be a fiscal expansion as well as a monetary expansion, would be helpful.
Okay.
Hi. I completely agree with the question regarding the importance of participation rates in relation to unemployment. The data problems in relation to unemployment are very under-researched. If you want to get long runs of unemployment data going back to the 19th century, you hit the basic problem that the word unemployment only came into the English language, I'm not sure about the German language, in the 1880s. And the records that you've got for unemployment up to the First World War relate to people who were members of trades unions. And one of the big reasons for being in a union in the build-up to the First World War in the UK was to get some unemployment insurance. There just wasn't state unemployment insurance before that time. Now, all these variables, the shift from private trade union organised to state unemployment trade union insurance have major problems. Now, to a degree, I think what people are picking up in relation to the effect of long-term unemployment channel for hysteresis is partly that some of the long-term unemployed just basically drop out of the labour market. Now, we really do need to have more work done on what exactly happens after people have been out of work for longer than 6 months, after a year, etc., etc. In relation to the points in relation to the duration of monetary policy easing or non-easing, that's a fascinating question in relation to price act models of hysteresis, because in a price act model, this crucial assumption is rate independence. What that means is that it's just the extremum values of the input shock variables, if you like, the policy shock variables that affect, have a remaining effects on unemployment. Now, if there were to be an effect coming from the rate of change of the input shock variables between the extremum values, this would be in conflict with the price act type model. So that in itself is a fascinating question. And then finally, in relation to the issue of fiscal policy, I think that the work that Olivier Blanchard and a colleague Lee have done at the IMF in relation to the effects of state-dependent multipliers touches on this issues. There's a regression equation in which they regressed the planned fiscal consolidation on the outcomes, and the estimated coefficient should have been 0 if, on average, the forecasters had a true model. Now, the fact that the coefficient was way away from 0 suggests that there is traction coming from the fiscal policy variables, and it would be fascinating to see an extension of the work that Larry Ball has done in relation to monetary policy to fiscal policy variables.
Yes, this friend is working. Well, these were comments or friendly amendments to the argument that I've been making. I, of course, have been trying to present a version of the post-Keynesian argument that is as compatible as possible with a standard Nairo framework in order to make clear what I regard as the main differences. I should admit that I'm a macroeconomist, I'm not a labor economist, and in that I'm probably rather typical for a post-Keynesians. Post-Keynesians don't have a very rich analysis of the labor market in the sense of what would determine wage differentials, differential rates of employment in different groups and so on. So I'm afraid I don't have much to say on that. However, I do think that the issue about hidden unemployment, part-time work and so on, is a very important one. It is so important that you feel it strongly when you try to do macroeconomic modeling. In the theoretical models, it's fairly straightforward that if someone loses their job, they get unemployed. Usually we only have two in the simple models. Now in practice that is not the case. When I was involved in doing a macroeconomic model for Austria, it just emerged. It was not part of our research focus. Essentially that if two people lose their job, only one becomes unemployed. In other words, there's a huge gap of hidden unemployment. And in many cases, it may be as large as what we're observing. Similarly, in many countries, issues of involuntary part-time unemployment have become a major issue. In Britain, for example, we have not had much of, given the size of the recession and the following stagnation, there actually wasn't a very big change in the unemployment rate. However, the essentially hidden unemployment or corrected unemployment measures that Blanchflower has recently presented give much higher levels because they include discouraged workers and involuntary part-time unemployment. So I think that is empirically a very important issue.
Okay, thank you. So we have time for a second round now. I have Tom Pally here, then I have the gentleman afterwards, you sir, yes, and then you afterwards, please.
Tom Pally from the AFL-CIO. In the interest of clarity, I'd like to press Larry Ball a little bit more about sort of the economic details of his story. You referred, I would say, to work by Summers and Blanchard from 1985, I think, on their insider-outsider model. And so that's sort of part of the story that's preventing the system from adjusting. Is that correct? Is that what you intended to say? Is the problem, what is stopping the system from going back to full employment? Is it a wage rigidity story? Perhaps real wage rigidity based on insider-outsiders, maybe with a nominal element due to long-term contracting? Or is it some other story? What is your micro foundation that is stopping your economy from adjusting and thereby needing the assistance of monetary policy?
Okay.
Jerry Epstein, University of Massachusetts at Amherst. Thanks for an excellent panel. There's a paradox here that some of you have touched on. Rod Cross talked about the persistence of these ideas in the economics profession and in the policy world despite the lack of theoretical or empirical rigor and evidence for it. And Engelbert talks about the fact that so many economies are wage-led. And the evidence about the Nehru suggests that economic expansion should lift most boats. That is, there should be a political coalition out there that would support this kind of expansionary policy and that would pressure economists to live up to what their evidence is really showing them, that the persistence of the Nehru makes no sense at all. So I was wondering if you could speculate about why you think there isn't this political coalition that's emerging in our various countries that will implement what the economics and the evidence is telling us.
Okay, then I had you.
Well, I'm Gilberto Lima from the University of São Paulo in Brazil. Tom has somehow stolen part of my question, but let me rephrase it. So it's to Larry Ball too. You mentioned that external variables will play a role. The current account, whether the exchange rate will depreciate, that will determine whether we'll go back to the previous level or not. So what's the mechanism through which you have these external variables preventing a return to the previous level?
Okay, anybody else? Particularly if you sit at the back, you'll have to wave your hands quite strongly because I have a light shining in my eyes here. If we have no one else, then I think we'll go back to the panel.
Okay, a couple comments on it. If I gave the impression that I was a big believer in the insider-outsider story, that's incorrect. I think that hasn't held up that well as far as explaining cross-country differences. I mean, to the extent I have any kind of story, it's what you would call the human capital story, or that the experience of being unemployed for a long time makes you less employable in the future. And again, as Rod said, the labor economists ought to get to work, or somebody, finding out what is it really that happens to people after 6 months or after a year. Either they they just become less employable, or for some reason put less downward pressure on wages and prices. Because I think normally the mechanism for why high unemployment goes back down is that high unemployment puts downward pressure on inflation, and when inflation falls enough, that leads to monetary expansion. So a lack of downward pressure on wages and prices would help to explain it. But that's vague. So a couple people, including Rod and one of the questioners, brought up the question of, if it's so obvious to all of us that there's lots of hysteresis, why hasn't the rest of the world caught on? And I've thought about that a lot. So I have four explanations. One, the lack of a clear theory. People think, well, maybe it's true in practice, but who cares? It's not true in theory, so we're going to ignore it. Number two, in policy circles, if you're at the European Central Bank, it will be awfully inconvenient to believe in hysteresis, because that means that if unemployment's high, it might be partly because of something monetary policy has done, and maybe monetary policy has a responsibility to try to reduce unemployment. So obviously, if you would like to focus on price stability, it's a lot easier to justify that if you say, well, unemployment is a terrible thing, but it's too bad we don't abolish unemployment insurance, or but central banks can't do that. The third explanation, which is related, is that I think in the history of thought, people took the lesson that in the 1960s, policymakers tried to push unemployment too low in the 60s and 70s and tried to exploit some unemployment inflation trade-off. And that was the big mistake of monetary policy. And so people are very quick. Hysteresis sort of reminds people of the bad old way of thinking, and it's going to lead to over-expansionary policy and inflation. And the fourth explanation, very specific, is I think a lot of it is Olivier Blanchard's fault, and I've told him that. Actually, he has come around a little bit lately, but after being so Blanchard and Summers are the ones who popularized this, and then Summers got busy doing other things, and Blanchard actually wrote a bunch of papers on unemployment, de-emphasizing hysteresis and acting like he didn't believe in it anymore. And given how people usually promote their own ideas and stick to them even when they've been disproved, the fact that even one of the big proponents of hysteresis seemed to reject it meant it lost a lot of credibility. I think that was a very specific practical thing. And briefly on the external things, I think it's probably as simple as if you allow the exchange rate to fall, that leads to export-led growth, and that pushes down unemployment, would be my very short answer to that.
Hi, on Tom Palley's points in relation to what happens to unemployed people. Well, if you go back to the great depressions of the interwar period in the UK, we're talking about 1920s, a lot of other European countries and the US were talking about the 1930s. There were outfits such as the Pilgrim Trust who carefully documented what happens to people after long spells on the dole. You become a different person. You become depressed. Your physical capacities depreciate. You're more likely to commit suicide. You're more likely to have problems with your family and other relationships. In effect, you become a different person. That's basically the mechanism. In relation to the issue of if history stories are so good, why have people not taken them on board? Well, if we take the first point that Larry identified, there's no clear theory. Well, I think there is a clear theory. The problem is getting into mainstream economics publications, because if you don't have the representative agents at the course of the actions, I could show you a sheath of rejection letters saying no micro foundations, right? And sometimes one of the referees, such as American Economic Review, for example, one referee said, this is fantastic stuff, highly relevant, really innovative. The other referee said, no micro foundations. Where are the utility functions in all this sort of stuff? And the editor then said, well, a tough call, but I decided not to go against the grain. So that's the story there. We need a revolution in the publishing practices in the economics profession. I can publish such papers in top mathematics journals, such as the one run by the Journal of the American Mathematical Association, right? but not in so-called top economics journals. Second point in relation to the problem for policymakers. Well, I was asked to write a paper giving an account of Paul Samuelson's methodology for his 90th birthday celebrations at MIT. I was having a drink with Paul Blinder and Ben Bernanke. This was before Bernanke was appointed to the chairmanship of the Fed. He had a brief interlude on the Council of Economic Advisors before that. And basically, who might have been the chairman of the Fed? Alan Blinder. What was the problem? Well, it's a Jackson Hole conference. Topic is money neutral. Alan Blinder said, of course it's not. No. Immediately people said, we can't afford to appoint a central bank governor who's so honest. Now, what is the problem? Then you come on to the textbook story about the breakdown of the Phillips curve and the great rise of the natural rate hypothesis, which could explain the empirical failings of the Phillips curves. Well, this is just so much nonsense. Go back to reading Bill Phillips' paper, and you find that it's not just unemployment that drives inflation, it's also cost of living settlements. Right? The reason why they didn't figure in his estimates for 1861 to 1914 is that the price level was roughly constant, well, was stationary during that period, ups and downs during the cycle. Remember, this was gold standard phase. Right? And inflation also, according to Phillips, depended on the rate of change of unemployment. These are the loops in the Phillips curve. People just forgot about that story. Now, what is wrong with the economics profession? Can you not read these seminal papers? Right? Should this not be translated to students via the textbook? I think there's something wrong. Basically, if I talk to co-researchers who are increasingly these days mathematicians and point these things out, they say, how on earth can people get away with this? Right? That is a puzzle. Larry referred, then the fourth thing, the most influential hysteresis story was that of Olivier Blanchard and Larry Summers in the 80s, because these were bright young stars from the MIT stable. And if they were obviously influential for that reason, Larry Summers went on to do political things, but I remember when he was a brief spell as Treasury Secretary, he was talking about beneficial effects of the late 1990s boom in terms of training on the job, fewer people being in jail, reduction of racial conflict in the United States because of the higher propensity of non-whites to end up in jail if they were out of work and got themselves into trouble of just trying to survive. Now, in relation to Olivier, Olivier had the misfortune to, in 2007, to write down the words, "The state of macro is good." This was the highlight of the DSG models with the new Keynesian sort of stuff. Now, I guess Olivier's repented and gone back to his 1980s self, so welcome back, Olivier.
On Cherry's paradox, I mean, the discussion of hysteresis in the mainstream literature is actually, I would think, a quite interesting exercise in somersaults. If you look at, I mean, people have already talked about Larry Summers. The original Blanchard-Summers paper was in the more rebellious phase of the new Keynesians. Thereafter, the issue sort of disappeared, and some of them got excited about financial liberalization. And with the crisis, it suddenly was back. The Summers Bradford DeLong paper in the Brookings papers, it's complete self-evident that you have hysteresis. The only question is how big it is. But it's not a question of whether it exists or not, whereas it had been completely absent. in the same paper, it's also completely obvious that in normal times the fiscal multiplier is 0, but once you're in crisis, it suddenly becomes extremely high, and it even has long-run effects. Yeah? And if you look at the OECD publications on the labor market, you sort of have the same paradox. Before the crisis, it was completely clear that it's all about labor market institutions, and they were so sophisticated, and they even incorporated sort of varieties of capitalism garnishes into the labor market analysis. But it's all labor market institutions. And then with the crisis, it was clear that because of the crisis, we'll also have a substantial increase in structural unemployment, which is simply inconsistent with what they did earlier. And in a way, they're not embarrassed by the figure with which, the graph with which I started out. Yes, structural unemployment has increased. So it's fascinating how at least the applied part, or the more reality-oriented part of mainstream economics is dealing with that. I mean, the hardcore neoclassical theorists wouldn't even bother about what unemployment is doing, because they already know the answer. I have limited hope that the economics profession will be able to reform itself internally and enlighten itself by looking at reality. However, policymakers have to act. And as I do think that most academics at their very core, I have to say, are opportunists, once policymakers change course, I would think that they would also at least think about changing course. So the question is, which is one of the questions you raised, is why is there no political coalition behind that? And in a way that's similar to the question, or related to the question, why is there no political coalition behind reforming the financial sector? I mean, you would think that substantial parts of capital would also have an interest in getting rid of that, but it doesn't happen. And looking at history, it would seem that the New Deal experience was rather the exception than the rule. I mean, certainly the European experience in the 30s was not the one that you would expand, at least within democratic society, you would expand the welfare state. I don't have any profound explanation for that, but I would think it essentially comes down to class instincts on the part of capitalists. Now, I'm purposefully not saying class interest, because as a Kaleckian, of course, I would tell them that actually higher wages, at least in these circumstances, would further their own interests. But that is not how they perceive of it. Now, if you think about how the crisis works out, it does depend a lot on the specific circumstances to what extent states are in a position sort of to mediate that situation, and to what extent they are able to at least talk to capitalists about their long-term interests. And to some extent, that is what has happened in Germany during the recession. There, the capital accepted effectively a shortening of work time, which for them, in the grand scheme of things, was, though a temporary, increase in the real wage. And that was sort of part of a package. And effectively, the other European countries, or the European countries that would need such an arrangement most, are subject to international pressures that make it a lot harder to implement any of such arrangement that would allow for a cooperative way out of the crisis.
Okay, thanks. We're going to have to wind up pretty soon. What I would like to do is perhaps ask for one or two sentences from the panelists again. We've had a lot of interesting discussions about some theoretical aspects of hysteresis, some empirical evidence. What about the current situation of policy? I started off by saying we have unemployment in the euro area at 12.1%. In the UK, Rod, it's, 7.8%. In the US, it's about the same, I believe, but the EPOP is very, very depressed. Now there's a big debate about, as Johan was saying, about how indicative the unemployment rate is. What I would like, all the central banks in these three areas are at the zero lower bound. A couple of sentences, perhaps in the reverse order: euro area, Britain, the US. When are we going to get back to acceptable levels of unemployment, perhaps around 7% in the euro. I wouldn't, no, before you quote me that that's an acceptable rate of unemployment, but pre-crisis rates of unemployment in these three areas. A couple of sentences from each of you, and then we'll wrap up this session. Engelbert.
Well, first, 7% unemployment is not acceptable. I happen to be a Keynesian, and we think that you need full employment, and full employment realistically is 1 or 2% of unemployment maximum. How would you get there? Well, essentially, in the present situation, fiscal policy, massive expansion of fiscal expenditure. Monetary policy can accompany that by quantitative easing, but quantitative easing will not do the job and cannot do the job. In a situation where banks want to restructure the balance sheet, it's not going to do any good. The second thing that has to change is one needs a fundamental rethink on wage policy. The present, at least in Europe, essentially all the weight is put on downward wage adjustments in the countries with high unemployment. That's not going to work, but it's going to cause enormous social pain.
If you go back to the 1950s and 1960s in the UK, you had unemployment hovering in the 1.5, 2% range, and any significant rises above 2% tended to trigger expansionary policies at the centre, and the governments were scared that they wouldn't be re-elected if they didn't do something to sort that out. Now, what happened was that partly the influence of the natural rate doctrine, which is a very peculiar one in that, according to the natural rate, the equilibrium real variables, the natural rate of unemployment, the natural rate of output will be the same whether you've got minus 2% inflation, plus 2% inflation, plus 4% inflation, plus 40% inflation, plus 40,000% inflation. That's what the natural rate in its pure form suggests. Well, there came to be this problem that young children couldn't get to sleep at night because they were fearful of the evils of inflation. They would wake up screaming in the middle of the night, "Daddy, Mummy, is inflation going to rise above 2%?" Stuff like, well, what we need to do, obviously, is to create a framework where you don't have this straitjacket on policy. And Larry and Olivier Blanchard at the IMF have argued very coherently that the targeting inflation rates of 2% is far too low. It doesn't give you enough room for manoeuvre. There's a lot of evidence that the real economy tends to deteriorate if you, on average, trying to achieve that rate. So you need to push the inflation target up to 4 or 5%. I hope I'm not taking your lines.
Is it going to happen?
Larry has published quite a persuasive paper arguing precisely for the 4% target.
Right. I think my colleagues here avoided the question because the answer is so unpleasant. I think they've said we could reduce unemployment with a big fiscal expansion or possibly with a fairly radical change in monetary policy like a 4% inflation target. But I think the question was, when is this going to happen? And the answer is, for practical purposes, never. Or not in the anything foreseeable. In the U.S. and in Europe, the best we can possibly hope for from fiscal policy is that it doesn't do too much damage through excessive increases in austerity. And, the chances of the Federal Reserve adopting a 4% inflation target, it's a fun academic paper to write, but, sort of adopting communism is, roughly equally likely. There was last thing I'll say, the true story that, about Alan Blinder, right? Alan Blinder said that he was mad because what he did was endorse the Federal Reserve Act, and that should be okay for the vice chair of the Fed, because the Federal Reserve Act says you also have an employment goal. But the other story from Bob Woodward's popular book was that Alan Greenspan asked the outgoing vice chair to read some of Alan Blinder's papers, and the David Mullins, the outgoing vice chair, said, "Well, there's some problems here." And Greenspan, "What are the problems?" well, don't worry, it's not like he's a communist or anything. It's just he's a little soft on inflation. And Greenspan said, I'd rather that he were a communist. and you know, that was sort of a joke, but not entirely. So I think that's the mindset of policymakers. And given that's the mindset of policymakers, you know, we're going to see high unemployment indefinitely.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm slightly regretting having asked that last question.
Yeah,